Some men run to the mountains to escape their past, but the mountains have a way of bringing it all back. Silas Boone had spent 30 years in Wyoming's high country, trading human company for silence and his cattle dog Red for conversation. At 68, with gray streaking his beard and arthritis creeping into his joints, he figured his story was mostly written. Then Red started barking at an old cave wall covered in ancient markings, petroglyphs Silas had passed 100 times, without much notice. But when the afternoon light hit those carved symbols just right, something impossible happened. The stone figures began to move, not with his eyes, but deep in his heart, showing him faces he'd spent 3 decades trying to forget. His father's stern silhouette, his brother who never came home from the war, the woman he'd left behind when the mountains called louder than love. What did those ancient walls want him to remember, and why now? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Wind River Range had been Silas Boone's sanctuary for 3 decades, but sanctuary and prison sometimes wore the same face. His cabin sat at 9,000 feet, built from lodgepole pine he'd felled himself, one room with a stone fireplace, and shelves lined with books whose pages had grown soft from countless winter readings. Red lay across the threshold most mornings, his rust-colored coat catching first light through the aspens. The dog had been with Silas for 12 years, found as a pup near Dubois with ribs showing and trust nowhere to be found. They'd grown old together, learning each other's rhythms like an old married couple. Their days followed patterns carved by necessity. Dawn brought coffee boiled over coals. Silas would step onto his porch, cup warming his palms, watching mountains emerge from shadow like ancient gods stirring from sleep. Red would stretch, shake the night from his coat, and pad over to lean against Silas's leg, their morning greeting unchanged for years. But it was in the quiet hours that Silas felt the weight of his choices most keenly. He'd sit with coffee grown cold, watching Red nose through underbrush, and memories would creep in like morning mist. His father's voice, deep and measured, reading scripture at breakfast back on the Nebraska ranch. Samuel Boone had been carved from prairie wind and responsibility, hands calloused from work, heart heavy with the burden of doing right by family and land. He'd owned 4 sections of grazing land outside North Platte, built up over 2 generations of Boone sweat and stubbornness. The tarnished brass compass sat on Samuel's desk like a monument to staying the course. It had belonged to Silas's grandfather, carried through the Civil War and across the plains when the family first settled. Samuel polished it every Sunday after church, a ritual speaking of continuity and purpose. A man needs to know which direction he's headed, Samuel would tell Silas and his younger brother Tommy. Not just where he's going, but where he's been and why it matters. Tommy had understood that lesson. 2 years younger, but somehow older in ways that counted, Tommy embraced ranch life with quiet intensity. He could read weather by how cattle clustered gentle as spooked horse with just his voice, and talked about the ranch's future as if it were sacred trust passed down from above. When Tommy turned 18 in 1968, the war in Southeast Asia was devouring young men like hungry fire. The draft notice came on a Tuesday in March. Silas remembered watching his father read that slip of paper, saw how his shoulders settled with the weight, heard the quiet words, "We serve when called, son. It's what men do." Tommy left for basic training that spring. The ranch felt empty in ways having nothing to do with work needing done. Silas threw himself into daily routine, trying to fill his brother's space, but everything felt like playing at being a man instead of becoming one. Letters from Tommy came regularly at first, full of army humor and mess hall complaints. But gradually they changed, became quieter, more thoughtful. He wrote about other soldiers, boys from farms and cities equally scared and homesick. In his final letter from Cu Chi, he wrote about duty and sacrifice in words that sounded like their father's voice carried across an ocean. The telegram arrived on a Wednesday morning in late October. Samuel read it twice, folded it carefully, placed it in the Bible next to the compass, then walked to the barn and didn't return until after dark. That winter changed everything. The ranch work continued, but rhythm was broken. Samuel aged years. In months, his back bending under burdens, having nothing to do with physical labor. Silas felt the weight of expectations he'd never asked for and wasn't sure he could carry. There had been Sarah, of course. Sarah McKenna, with chestnut hair and laugh that could light up rooms, teaching third grade and bringing sunshine into Silas's dark world. They'd courted through that difficult winter, walking along the Platte River on Sunday afternoons, sharing dreams when the future still seemed full of possibility. The proposal had been expected, almost inevitable. Sarah said yes with tears in her eyes, and for a moment Silas felt he might become the man everyone expected. But expectations and reality were different animals. The engagement ring felt like a shackle, wedding plans like a countdown to imprisonment. The leaving hadn't been planned. It happened on a September morning when cottonwoods were turning and air carried winter's promise. Silas woke with restlessness in his bones that felt like fever. What was meant to be a morning ride became something else when he pointed his mare west instead of making familiar fence circuits. He rode for hours, pushing deeper into wild country, letting the horse find her own pace. The sun climbed high and still he rode, something inside uncoiling with every mile. When he topped a ridge and saw the Rockies rising like a promise on the western horizon, he understood what was happening. He was leaving. Not just for the day, but for good. The knowledge settled over him like cold wind, certain and terrifying, and somehow inevitable. He thought about Sarah waiting, his father expecting him home for supper, the compass pointing toward responsibilities he'd never wanted. And he thought about Tommy, who'd understood duty in ways Silas couldn't, who died for principles Silas couldn't even name. The choice felt less like deciding and more like surrendering to gravity. He turned west, toward mountains and whatever lay beyond, leaving behind everything he'd known and everyone who'd loved him. Guilt rode with him like a second shadow, but so did something else, lightness he hadn't felt since Tommy's telegram, a sense of possibility stretching wide as the sky. Now, 30 years later, that same sky arched over his cabin, and guilt had worn smooth like a stone polished by decades of handling. Red shifted against his leg, and Silas set down his empty cup to scratch behind the dog's ears. "What do you think, old boy? Think it's going to be a good day?" Red's tail thumped once, and Silas took that for agreement. The dog had learned to read his moods better than any human ever had. Today felt different somehow, charged with energy that came before thunderstorms, though the sky was clear. As Silas reached for his axe to split kindling, Red's sudden bark made him pause. The dog stared toward the southeast, where a game trail wound through timber toward cliffs Silas knew well. Red's ears were pricked forward, body tense with attention. "What is it, boy?" Silas asked. But Red was already moving, padding down the trail with purpose. Silas followed, rifle held loose in the crook of his arm. The trail led through whispering aspens, then climbed toward cliffs where ancient peoples had left their mark in stone. Silas had discovered the petroglyphs years ago, during wide-ranging explorations. The figures carved into rock were weathered by centuries, but still visible to those who knew how to look. Red stopped at the cliff's base, directly below where petroglyphs were most clearly visible. He sat back on his haunches and looked up at the stone face, then back at Silas, as if expecting something. Morning light hit the rock at just the right angle, illuminating ancient carvings with unusual clarity. Silas leaned his rifle against a boulder and stepped closer, studying the markings, with more attention than he'd ever given them. Human figures, animals, geometric patterns that might have meant something to their creators, but were mysteries to him. But as he stood there, with Red patient beside him and morning light playing across stone, something shifted in his perception. The figures seemed to take on depth and movement, as if emerging from the rock, his father's silhouette, unmistakable even in crude stone lines. Tommy's young face, forever frozen at 19, and Sarah, her hair flowing like water, her hand reaching toward him across 30 years of silence. 3 days passed before Silas could return to the cliff face. The vision haunted his waking hours and invaded his dreams with intensity that left him exhausted and on edge. Red seemed to sense his master's disturbance, staying closer to the cabin and watching Silas with patient concern. The pull became impossible to ignore on the 4th morning. Silas woke before dawn with his heart hammering, the taste of copper fear coating his tongue. He dreamed of Tommy again, but this time his brother had been older, weathered by experiences Silas could only imagine, eyes holding a sadness that encompassed all the years he'd never lived. "You left me," Tommy had said in the dream. "You left all of us." Silas dressed in pre-dawn darkness, hands trembling as he pulled on boots. Red rose from his place by the fire, ready to follow wherever his master's restless spirit might lead. When they reached the cliff base, Red immediately began whimpering, a sound Silas rarely heard from his stoic companion. The dog paced back and forth, occasionally looking up at the stone face, then back at Silas with an almost pleading expression. He lit his kerosene lantern and held it high, casting flickering light across ancient carvings. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The same weathered figures he'd seen countless times, but as flame steadied, the petroglyphs began to shift and dance. Human figures seemed to turn carved heads toward him. Animals appeared to move through their stone landscape with fluid grace. And slowly, impossibly, Silas began to recognize faces in the abstract shapes. His father stood there in the rock, tall and stern, holding what looked like the brass compass. Samuel Boone's mouth moved as if speaking. But Silas heard nothing except wind through aspens and Red's continued whimpering. Then Tommy emerged from stone, and Silas felt his knees go weak. His brother wore a soldier's uniform, crisp and clean, but his face carried weight of experiences no 19-year-old should have endured, eyes holding a mixture of accusation and forgiveness that cut through Silas's heart. The vision expanded, showing scenes Silas had never witnessed, but somehow knew to be true. Tommy in a rice paddy, water to his chest, leading patrol through terrain that wanted to swallow them alive. Tommy writing letters by candlelight in a tent that leaked with every monsoon rain. Tommy holding a wounded soldier, trying to keep him calm as helicopters struggled to reach their position through heavy fire. And then the final scene, the one that made Silas cry out and stumble backward. Tommy standing alone in a clearing, rifle empty, facing an enemy force that outnumbered him 10-1. He could have run, could have saved himself, but there were wounded men behind him who couldn't move, and Tommy had never learned how to abandon those who depended on him. The vision showed Tommy's last moments with clarity of a photograph and inevitability of answered prayer. Silas watched his brother die for principles their father had instilled, for duty Silas had rejected in favor of freedom. As the carved figure fell in stone, something materialized at the cliff's base, something that shouldn't have existed, but was undeniably real. Dog tags, corroded by years and humidity, but still readable in the lantern's flickering light. Thomas, Samuel Boone, followed by numbers and letters, speaking of official bureaucracy and military precision. Silas picked them up with shaking hands, feeling weight of metal that had hung around his brother's neck for the last months of his life. Tags were warm, as if just removed from living flesh instead of emerging from solid rock. They carried the smell of jungle rot and cordite, sweat and fear, and the particular metallic scent of blood. Silas held them to his chest and felt 30 years of suppressed guilt crash over him like an avalanche. He'd been exploring mountain trails when Tommy died alone in a Vietnamese jungle. He'd been learning to fish mountain streams when his brother bled out in a foreign land. He'd been discovering freedom of a life without obligations, while Tommy fulfilled obligations that should have been shared. The lantern slipped from numb fingers and shattered on rocks, plunging the cliff face into grey twilight of approaching dawn. But visions continued, playing in his mind with unstoppable force. He saw his father reading the telegram announcing Tommy's death, saw how the old man's shoulders slumped as if the world's weight had settled on them. He saw Sarah attending the funeral alone, standing at the church's back and wondering where the man she was supposed to marry had gone. Red's barking brought him back to the present moment. The dog danced around him in agitation, alternately nuzzling his leg and backing away, as if uncertain whether his master was still the man he'd always known. Silas realized he was hyperventilating, great gasping breaths that weren't bringing enough oxygen. He stumbled away from the cliff face, Tommy's dog tags clutched in his fist, and barely made it to a fallen log before his legs gave out entirely. The mountain morning spun around him, and for a moment he thought he might be having a heart attack, but gradually, with Red pressed warm against his side and familiar smells of pine and morning air filling his nostrils, the panic attack began to subside. His breathing slowed, vision cleared, and the crushing weight on his chest eased enough for him to straighten up. Dawn was breaking over eastern peaks, painting sky in shades of rose and gold that would have been beautiful under other circumstances. The cliff face looked ordinary again, just weathered stone marked with ancient carvings that meant nothing to anyone living. But the dog tags in his hand were real enough, solid metal that spoke of truths he'd spent 30 years trying to escape. "I'm all right, boy," Silas said, his voice hoarse. "I think I'm all right." But he wasn't all right, and they both knew it. Something had been broken open inside him, some carefully constructed dam that had held back 30 years of accumulated guilt and regret. The visions had shown him truths he'd always known, but never acknowledged, that his freedom had been purchased with other people's pain, that his escape from responsibility had left others to carry burdens that should have been shared. Tommy's dog tag seemed to pulse with warmth in his closed fist, a heartbeat from beyond the grave. Silas opened his hand and studied them in growing light, reading his brother's name and service number, seeing the small dent that might have come from shrapnel or simply from years of wearing against a young man's chest. The walk back to the cabin passed in a haze of emotional exhaustion. Red stayed close, occasionally pressing against Silas's leg, as if to remind him that he wasn't entirely alone in the world. When they reached the cabin, Silas sat heavily on his front porch and stared out at mountains that had sheltered him for 3 decades. They looked the same as always, massive, eternal, indifferent to human struggles and pain. But something fundamental had changed in his relationship with them. They no longer felt like sanctuary. They felt like prison walls he'd built around himself, keeping the world out and keeping himself from becoming the man he was supposed to be. Sleep became a stranger to Silas in the days that followed. He would lie in his narrow bed, listening to Red's steady breathing and feel the weight of Tommy's dog tags on his nightstand. Every time he closed his eyes, visions returned, not just from the cliff face now, but memories his mind had kept locked away for 3 decades. He saw Tommy at 7, following him around the ranch like a devoted shadow, desperate to do whatever his big brother was doing. He remembered teaching Tommy to ride, watching him bounce on the old mare's back until he found his balance and rode around the corral with a grin that could have lit up the county. But mostly he remembered their last conversation before Tommy left for basic training. They'd walked to the stock pond in evening, when cattle were coming to drink and sky was painted purple and gold. Tommy had been quiet, but there was weight to his silence that made Silas pay attention. "You ever think about what Pa expects from us?" Tommy had asked, skipping stones across still water. "All the time," Silas had answered. "I mean, really think about it. About carrying on the family name, keeping the ranch going, maybe having sons to pass it all down to." Tommy paused and looked directly at Silas. "Sometimes I wonder if we're strong enough for all that responsibility." Silas had laughed because at 21 he'd thought himself invincible. "We're Boones. Strong enough is what we do." But Tommy hadn't laughed. He'd just nodded and gone back to skipping stones, and Silas had missed the real meaning entirely. Tommy hadn't been questioning their strength. He'd been wondering if Silas would be there to share the load when time came. Now, lying sleepless in his mountain cabin, Silas understood what his brother had been trying to say. Tommy had faced the prospect of war with quiet acceptance, not because he wasn't afraid, but because he believed duty was bigger than fear. And he'd gone believing his older brother would be there to take care of their parents if something happened. Instead, Silas had run away like a coward, leaving their father to face grief alone and their mother to die 2 years later from a heart that couldn't bear more sorrow. He'd learned about her death from a letter that had taken months to reach him. By the time he'd gotten the news, she'd been in the ground for half a year. The guilt was like acid in his stomach, eating away at whatever peace he'd found in mountain exile. He would rise before dawn and try to lose himself in familiar routines, checking snares, tending his garden, splitting firewood. But nothing worked the way it used to. Every task felt hollow. Every moment of solitude felt like selfishness. Red seemed to understand his master was struggling with demons that had nothing to do with weather or wildlife. The dog stayed closer than usual, following Silas around the cabin and rarely straying far during their daily walks. It was Red who led him to the cache. They'd been walking the perimeter of Silas's territory, checking game trails for signs of the elk herd that usually moved through in late summer. Red suddenly veered off the familiar path and headed toward broken ground, where avalanche debris had created a jumbled landscape of fallen trees and scattered boulders. Red was pawing at something buried under rocks and dead leaves, something that looked deliberately hidden rather than randomly deposited by weather. Silas knelt and began clearing debris, wondering what kind of animal might have made such a cache. What he found was a leather saddlebag, old and weathered, but still intact. His saddlebag, the one he'd carried when he first came to the mountains 30 years ago. He remembered hiding it here during his first winter, when he'd been learning hard lessons of mountain survival, and thought he might need to retrieve cached supplies. But he'd never come back for it. He'd learned to live with less, to make do with what the mountains provided, and had forgotten about the saddlebag entirely. The buckles fought him, stiff with age, but finally gave way. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas, were items he'd forgotten he owned. A photograph of the family, taken at Christmas the year before Tommy left for the army, his mother's Bible, with her careful notes in the margins, a letter from Sarah, written during their engagement and never opened because he'd left before it arrived, and at the bottom, wrapped in blue velvet, was his father's compass. Silas lifted it out with trembling hands. The brass was tarnished black in places, but the glass face was uncracked, and when he held it steady, the needle swung to magnetic north with the same certainty it had shown for 3 generations. He'd taken the compass the night he left, telling himself it was for navigation, but he'd never used it for that. He'd always known which direction he was running. Now he understood he'd taken it for another reason entirely, some part of him hoping to carry his father's approval into exile, even as he rejected everything the old man stood for. The photograph showed them gathered around the Christmas tree. His mother in her best dress, smiling despite worry lines around her eyes, his father standing straight and proud, hands resting on his son's shoulders, and the 2 brothers, so young and confident, with no idea how quickly their world would change. The letter from Sarah was written on yellowed paper, her careful handwriting still legible despite the years. Silas held it for a long time without opening it, knowing whatever it contained would only add to the weight of regret he was already carrying. But finally, with Red watching patiently, he unfolded the pages and began to read. "My dearest Silas," it began, And just those 3 words transported him back to the ranch house parlor, where Sarah used to sit by the fireplace working on lesson plans while he pretended to read and actually just watched firelight play across her face. The letter was full of wedding plans and dreams of their future together. Sarah wrote about the dress she was having made, about flowers she wanted, about children they would have, and the life they would build. Her words were full of love and trust and certainty that their future was as solid as ground beneath their feet. But toward the end, her tone changed. She wrote about rumors she'd heard in town, whispers that Silas had been seen riding alone toward the foothills, that he'd been asking about trails leading into the mountains. She wrote about growing worry, that he was having second thoughts, about her fear that responsibility was weighing too heavily on his mind. I want you to know, she wrote, that whatever you're thinking, whatever you're feeling, we can work through it together. That's what marriage means, facing difficult times as well as easy ones. Please don't try to carry your burdens alone. Please don't shut me out when I only want to help. The letter ended with a declaration of love and faith, signed formally, but with a postscript that cut straight through his heart. I'll wait for you no matter how long it takes for you to find your way home. Silas folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the saddlebag, but he kept the compass in his hand, feeling its familiar weight, and remembering Sunday afternoons when his father polished it while talking about knowing where you stood in the world. For 30 years, Silas had been heading in only one direction, away from responsibility, away from difficulty, away from anything that might require him to be more than he thought capable of being. But now, sitting in a hidden clearing with his father's compass in one hand and Tommy's dog tags in his pocket, he wondered if there might be other directions worth exploring. The decision to burn Sarah's letters came at 3 in the morning, when cabin walls felt like they were closing in, and the weight of the past was crushing breath from his lungs. He'd been lying awake for hours, thinking about the words Sarah had written 30 years ago. The love in those pages felt like accusations now, each tender sentiment a reminder of trust he'd betrayed. He rose quietly, not wanting to wake Red, and padded to the fireplace where embers from evening's fire still glowed. A few pieces of kindling brought flames back to life, painting the cabin's interior in dancing shadows. The letters lay on his table where he'd left them after reading each one twice. There were 7 in total, written over 3 months between his disappearance and, he assumed, her realization that he wasn't coming back. The first was the one he'd found in the saddlebag, full of wedding plans and innocent trust. The others had been forwarded to him over the years, always arriving too late and always going unopened because the guilt was more than he could bear. He picked up the bundle and held them toward the flames. It would be easy to let fire take them, to erase this evidence of pain he'd caused, but as heat warmed his hands, he found himself unable to let go. These letters represented the only connection he had to the woman he'd loved and abandoned, the only proof their relationship had been real. Instead, he pulled back from flames and sat heavily in his chair. Red stirred at the sound, lifting his grizzled head before settling back to sleep with a soft sigh. "Can't do it, boy," Silas whispered. "Can't burn away the only piece of her I've got left." He reached for the whiskey bottle he kept for medicinal purposes and sleepless nights. The liquor burned going down, but brought warmth that had nothing to do with fire, and gradually the tight feeling in his chest began to ease. The whiskey made him brave enough to open the second letter, postmarked 2 weeks after the first. Sarah's handwriting was less steady, and her words carried first hints of worry absent from initial correspondence. "Dearest Silas," it began, "I hope this finds you well, wherever you may be. Your father says you've gone to check cattle in far pastures, but it's been 2 weeks now, and I'm starting to worry. The weather has been clear, so I know it's not storms keeping you away." The letter described mundane details of her daily life. Children in her classroom struggling with arithmetic, new curtains she was sewing, gossip from town that seemed important then but had been rendered meaningless by years. But it was the ending that cut deepest. I keep watching the horizon, expecting to see you riding home with that easy smile and some story about what kept you away so long. Please come home soon, my love. The world feels empty without you in it. By the 5th letter, dated 2 months after his disappearance, Sarah's pain had crystallized into something colder and more final. She wrote about the wedding dress she'd had to return, about invitations that had been recalled, about sympathetic looks from neighbors who'd watched her humiliation play out in public. I realize now that I never really knew you, she wrote. The man I thought I loved would never have left without explanation, would never have allowed people who cared about him to worry and search and grieve for nothing. The 7th and final letter was different from all the others. It was dated 4 months after Silas had left, and the handwriting was steadier, more controlled. Sarah wrote like a woman who had made peace with circumstances beyond her control. This will be my last letter, it began. I need to stop hoping you'll come back, stop waiting for explanations that will never come. I need to build a life that doesn't depend on someone who chose to walk away. But then the tone softened, and for just a moment, the woman who had loved him completely broke through careful composure. I want you to know that I don't hate you, Silas. I don't understand you, and I'll probably never forgive you, but I don't hate you. The letter ended with news that hit Silas like a physical blow. I wanted you to know that I'm carrying your child. The baby will be born in spring, and I've decided to keep it regardless of the scandal. This child will be the only good thing to come from our time together. She'd signed simply Sarah, but there was a postscript that made his hands shake. If you ever decide you want to be the father this child deserves, you know where to find us. But don't come back just because you feel obligated. Come back because you've learned how to stay. Silas set the letter down with trembling hands and stared into the fire. He had a child, had fathered a baby he'd never seen, never held, never even known existed until this moment. The child would be 29 years old now, fully grown, probably, with children of their own. The whiskey bottle was empty, and the fire had burned down to glowing coals, but Silas sat motionless, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he'd learned. He'd always known his departure had caused pain, but he'd told himself people would recover, would move on, would build better lives without him. The reality was so much worse than anything he'd imagined. Sarah had faced single motherhood in an era when such things brought shame and hardship. His parents had lost both their sons and died believing themselves failures. The ranch had been lost because there was no one left to care for it, and somewhere out there was a child who had grown up without a father, whose mother had been forced to carry the burden of explanation and judgment alone. His child, who might have his eyes or his stubborn streak or his love of wide-open spaces. His child, who had never known their father, thought about them every day, even when he'd been too much of a coward to acknowledge their existence. The compass, in his pocket, seemed to burn against his chest, and Silas pulled it out to stare at the steady needle pointing north. His father had been right about needing to know which direction you were headed. For 30 years, Silas had been running in circles, thinking he was exploring when really he was just avoiding the responsibility of choosing a destination and sticking with it. But maybe it wasn't too late to change course. Maybe, if he had courage to follow the compass toward truth instead of away from it, he might still find a way to make amends for some of the damage he'd caused. The pull of the cave became irresistible after Silas read Sarah's final letter. Despite every rational part of his mind telling him to stay away, he found himself drawn back to the cliff face like iron filings to a magnet. Red seemed to sense his master's turmoil and padded beside him with unusual quiet. This time, Silas brought supplies for a longer stay: bedroll, jerky, water, and a lantern with enough oil to burn through the night. Whatever the cave was trying to show him, he was determined to face it completely, rather than running at the first sign of discomfort. Afternoon light slanted through pines when they reached the cliff face, painting petroglyphs in gold and amber. that made them seem almost alive before visions began. Red settled at the cliff's base with resignation of a dog who understood his master needed to confront demons having nothing to do with the natural world. As flames steadied and began casting dancing shadows, visions returned with force that nearly knocked Silas backward. This time, Tommy emerged from rock with startling clarity. His brother looked older than the 19-year-old who had left for Vietnam, but not much older. War had aged him in ways having nothing to do with years, carving lines around his eyes, and adding gravity to his bearing that spoke of responsibilities no teenager should carry. He wore jungle fatigues, clean and pressed, and his hands rested on equipment meant for healing rather than harm. The vision expanded, showing scenes from Tommy's time in Southeast Asia that Silas had never imagined. He saw his brother working in a field hospital, holding hands of wounded soldiers and speaking comfort in a voice steady with purpose. He saw Tommy volunteering for dangerous missions, not because he craved glory, but because he couldn't bear to let other men face risks he wasn't willing to share. Most clearly, he saw the moment that would define his brother's legacy. Tommy and his squad had been assigned to escort medical supplies to a remote outpost where wounded soldiers waited for evacuation. Intelligence suggested the route was clear, but intelligence in that war was often wishful thinking disguised as fact. The ambush came at a river crossing where vehicles had to slow and bunch together. The first rocket-propelled grenade disabled the lead truck, blocking the narrow bridge and trapping the convoy. Machine gun fire erupted from concealed positions, and within seconds they were taking casualties they couldn't afford. Tommy had been in the third vehicle, but as soon as shooting started, he was out and moving toward the wounded. Silas watched. His brother dragged injured soldiers to cover, applying pressure to wounds and calling for medics with a voice that carried over battle's chaos. The vision showed Tommy's final battle from his perspective, and Silas felt his brother's fear as clearly as if it were his own. But he also felt something else, determination that burned brighter than fear, refusal to let good men die while he still had strength to help them. As enemy fire intensified, Tommy realized the convoy couldn't move without leaving wounded men behind. The only option was to hold position until air support arrived, but that meant someone had to keep the enemy pinned down long enough for helicopters to reach them. Without hesitation, Tommy gathered every working rifle and moved to a position, giving him clear lines of fire to enemy positions. He was completely exposed, but from behind a fallen tree, he could cover the entire perimeter and give wounded men a chance to reach safety. Silas watched his brother's final battle with clarity of perfect hindsight and agony of absolute helplessness. Tommy held his position for 27 minutes, firing with mechanical precision and calling out encouragement to the men he was protecting. When ammunition ran low, he used grenades. When grenades were gone, he picked up weapons from fallen comrades. The end came quickly, but not quietly. Tommy was reloading when a mortar round landed close enough to lift him off his feet and slam him into a massive tree. Silas felt his brother's pain as shrapnel tore through his body, felt his struggle to remain conscious as blood filled his lungs. But Tommy's last act wasn't surrender. With his dying breath, he managed to throw his final grenade into an enemy position, preparing to overrun the landing zone. The explosion cleared the way for helicopters to land safely and evacuate the survivors, men who lived because Tommy Boone chose duty over self-preservation. As the vision faded, something materialized at Silas's feet that made his knees buckle. It was a Purple Heart medal, bronze still bright despite decades, ribbon clean as if just removed from its presentation box. The medal was warm to the touch, and when Silas picked it up, he could smell cordite and jungle rot and the metallic scent of spilled blood. There was something else attached, a citation written in formal military language, but describing acts of courage that transcended anything words could convey. The document detailed Tommy's actions during the ambush, his refusal to abandon wounded comrades, his willingness to sacrifice his life to ensure others could live. The citation ended with words that burned into Silas's memory. Private Thomas. Samuel Boone distinguished himself by conspicuous gallantry above and beyond the call of duty. His selfless courage saved the lives of 12 wounded soldiers and enabled successful evacuation of critical medical supplies. 12 men lived because his brother had been willing to die. While Silas had been exploring mountain trails, his little brother had been facing the ultimate test of character and passing it with grace that left Silas feeling hollow and ashamed. The contrast between Tommy's courage and his own cowardice was so stark it took his breath away. Tommy had volunteered for dangerous missions, while Silas had run from simple responsibility. Tommy had stayed to help wounded comrades, while Silas had abandoned his family when they needed him most. The Purple Heart seemed to pulse with warmth in his hands, and Silas understood this wasn't just a medal, it was a challenge. Tommy had faced the ultimate test and proven himself worthy of the Boone name, worthy of their father's pride, worthy of the sacrifices previous generations had made. Now it was Silas's turn to prove himself, even if he was 30 years too late. Red whined softly and pressed against his leg, offering comfort of simple companionship. The dog's presence reminded Silas he wasn't completely alone, that there was at least one creature who believed he was worth loving, despite his failures. But Red was getting old, his movements stiffer, his breathing more labored after their walks. The thought of losing Red terrified Silas in ways he hadn't expected. The dog had been his constant companion for 12 years, the one relationship he'd managed not to destroy through selfishness or fear. Red had never asked for explanations or demanded promises, just offered loyalty and love and steady presence that made solitude bearable instead of crushing. The lantern flame flickered and steadied, casting fresh shadows across petroglyphs. The stone figures seemed to be watching him with patient attention, waiting to see if he had learned anything from the visions they'd shown. Tommy's Purple Heart grew heavy in his hands, not with physical weight, but with the burden of expectation and possibility of redemption. For the first time in 30 years, Silas began to understand what courage really meant. It wasn't the absence of fear. Tommy had been terrified during that final battle. True courage was doing what needed to be done despite the fear, facing responsibility even when it would be easier to run away. The compass in his pocket pointed steadily north, toward whatever lay beyond his mountain sanctuary. Maybe it was time to stop running and start walking in that direction. Not because the journey would be easy, but because it was the only path that led toward the man his father had hoped he would become, and his brother had died believing he could be. The third night at the cave brought Sarah back to him in ways that made previous visions seem like gentle preparation. Silas had dozed fitfully against his bedroll when petroglyphs began to glow with inner light, having nothing to do with his flickering lantern. This time, Sarah emerged not as the young woman he'd left behind, but as she would have appeared in years following his departure. The visions showed her transformation from hopeful bride to abandoned woman to struggling mother, with clarity that felt like watching his own judgment unfold. First came the scene he'd been dreading, Sarah alone. In her small house, body growing heavy with the child she carried. The shame in her bearing was unmistakable, the way she held her head high despite whispered conversations that stopped when she entered the general store. Silas watched her teach her students while pregnancy showed, saw how she deflected children's innocent questions about when she would marry their baby's father. She told them simple truths wrapped in gentle words, that sometimes grown-ups made different choices than expected, that love could exist even when people couldn't be together. The visions moved through her pregnancy with merciless detail. Sarah, working late into evening, grading papers by lamplight while her back ached and feet swelled. Sarah walking alone to church and sitting in the back pew, ignoring pointed stares of neighbors who thought her condition was public shame. Sarah standing at her kitchen window, one hand resting on her rounded belly, watching the horizon for a rider who would never come. When labor began on a cold April morning, Sarah faced it alone, except for the midwife and doctor. Silas felt her pain as clearly as if it were his own, experienced every contraction as she brought their child in too. The world without a husband's hand to hold. The baby was a girl, perfect and healthy, with dark hair and eyes that would grow to mirror Silas's own. Sarah named her Emma, a simple, strong name that meant whole, as if she were determined this child would lack for nothing despite circumstances of her birth. The early years were hardest. Sarah continued teaching because she needed income, but caring for an infant while managing a classroom pushed her to limits of endurance. She would arrive early to prepare lessons while Emma slept in a basket beside her desk, stay late to grade papers while the baby played among primers and chalk dust. But gradually, visions revealed Sarah's remarkable strength. She created a life for herself and Emma that was full of love and purpose, despite the absence of husband and father. She taught her daughter to read before she was 4, shared her love of books and learning in quiet moments after school. Most remarkably, Sarah never spoke of Silas with bitterness, at least not where Emma could hear. When the little girl asked about her father, and she did with persistent curiosity of childhood, Sarah told her he was a good man who had chosen a different path, that sometimes even good people made choices that hurt those they loved. The visions showed Emma growing from infant to child to young woman, and Silas saw himself reflected in her features and mannerisms. She had his stubbornness and love of outdoors, but she'd inherited Sarah's patience and gentle wisdom. She was bright and curious, excelling in school, and showing early interest in the natural world. When Emma graduated high school, she announced her intention to study natural resource management. "I want to work in the national parks," she explained as they sat on their front porch, watching sunset paint distant mountains. "I want to protect wild places and help people understand why they matter." I think maybe that's what he would have wanted if he'd stayed long enough to know me. The vision showed Emma in college, thriving despite challenges of being one of only a handful of women in her program. After graduation, she took a position with Grand Teton National Park, working as an interpretive naturalist and eventually advancing to become a full ranger. It was in the final vision that Silas saw something that made his heart stop. Emma, now in her late 20s, standing on a mountainside that looked remarkably familiar, studying a rock formation Silas recognized as being less than a day's ride from his cabin. She was taking photographs and making notes, documenting geological features of the Wind River Range. His daughter was working in the same mountains where he'd hidden for 30 years, probably passing within miles of his cabin without knowing her father lived like a hermit in the high country. As the vision faded, something materialized that confirmed his worst fears and greatest hopes. It was a photograph, crisp and recent, showing Emma in her park ranger uniform. She stood beside a trail sign, smiling with an expression combining Sarah's gentleness with Silas's own determination. The resemblance was unmistakable, but it was the setting that nearly brought him to his knees. Behind Emma, clearly visible in the background, were the distinctive peaks of the Wind River Range. The photo had been taken somewhere in the Bridger Teton National Forest, probably within a day's hike of where Silas sat holding it. His daughter was here, in his mountains, doing work he should have respected and supported. She'd grown up without him, but had somehow found her way to the places he loved, as if some genetic compass had pointed her toward landscapes that had shaped both her parents. The photograph grew warm in his hands, and Silas understood this wasn't just evidence of his daughter's existence, it was an invitation. Emma was close enough to find, working in country he knew better than any civilized man had a right to. If he had courage to leave his mountain sanctuary, If he could find strength to face consequences of his choices, he might still have a chance. To know the remarkable woman his daughter had become. Silas woke to Red's labored breathing and the kind of silence that made his blood run cold. The dog lay on his side beside the dying campfire, his chest rising and falling in shallow gasps that spoke of systems shutting down. His eyes were open but distant, and when Silas knelt beside him, Red barely managed to lift his grizzled head. "Easy, old boy," Silas whispered, checking the dog's pulse and feeling the erratic flutter of a failing heart. "Just take it easy." But Red's breathing grew more labored with each passing moment, and Silas realized his oldest friend was dying. Desperation made him do something he hadn't done in 30 years. He prayed, not formal prayers of his childhood, but the raw plea of a man who had finally found something worth begging for. "Please," he said, pressing his hands against Red's side. "Not him. Not now. I know I don't deserve consideration, but he does. Red's been good his whole life, loyal and patient and everything I should have been." The words echoed off the cliff face and seemed to hang in the pre-dawn air, and for a moment Silas thought he heard something responding from the shadows beyond his dying campfire. Footsteps, perhaps, or the whisper of fabric against stone. Instead of darkness, he found himself looking at a man who seemed to have materialized from the cliff face itself. The stranger was Native American, probably in his 70s, with silver, hair braided with feathers and small bones. His face was weathered by decades of sun and wind, deeply lined but somehow ageless, and his dark eyes held patient wisdom that came from watching the world change while remaining fundamentally constant. He wore traditional clothing, buckskin shirt and leggings, beaded moccasins, and a medicine bundle hanging from his belt. "You have been coming here for many nights," the man said, his voice carrying the slight accent of someone for whom English was learned rather than native. "The spirits told me you were finally ready to listen." "Who are you?" Silas blinked, wondering if grief had pushed him into hallucination. "I am Joseph Crow Feather," the man replied, settling cross-legged beside the fire. "My people call me a bridge walker, one who helps lost souls find their way between worlds. I have been watching you, Silas Boone." "How do you know me?" Joseph gestured toward the petroglyphs. "This is a sacred place, a healing ground where ancestors speak to those ready to hear their voices. I am its keeper, the one who helps interpret messages for those brave enough to receive them. The visions, my father, my brother Sarah, they were real? Real as anything in this world," Joseph confirmed, "but not supernatural. The spirits work through mind and heart, showing us truths we've kept hidden from ourselves. The petroglyphs are conduits, focusing points that help the conscious mind access what the soul already knows." Red's breathing grew more shallow, and Silas turned his attention back to his dying companion. "Can you help him?" "All things have their season," Joseph said quietly. "Red has served his purpose in your life, brought you to this moment of choice. But his time is not yet finished, if you are willing to accept what must come next." "What do you mean?" Joseph reached into his medicine bundle and withdrew a pouch made from soft leather, decorated with intricate beadwork that seemed to shift. "In the firelight, this is sacred sage, blessed by 7 generations of my family's medicine men. It can extend life, ease suffering, provide strength for difficult journeys. But its power comes with a price." "What kind of price?" "Truth," Joseph said simply. "Complete honesty about who you are and what you've done. Red's life can be extended, but only if you use that time to become the man he deserves to follow." "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "Leave this mountain," Joseph said. "Go down to the world below and face what you've been running from. Find your daughter, Emma. Tell her who you are and ask for forgiveness you don't deserve but desperately need." The prospect terrified Silas more than any physical danger he'd ever faced. "And if I can't? If she rejects me? Then you'll have tried," Joseph replied. "And trying, even when success is uncertain, is what separates men from cowards." Red's breathing had become barely perceptible, and Silas realized he was running out of time. The choice was simple in its starkness: continue hiding and watch. His last connection to love die, or accept the challenge and risk everything on the possibility of redemption. Joseph opened the pouch and sprinkled sage onto the dying coals. The herbs caught immediately, filling the air with smoke that smelled of prairie grass and summer rain, and things too ancient to have names. Red's breathing seemed to steady slightly, and some of the distance left his eyes. The medicine will give him strength for the journey down from the mountain, Joseph explained, but his renewed health depends on your commitment to the path. If you turn back, if you choose comfort over courage, the sacred power will fade, and he will die as he was meant to die, alone like you have chosen to live. Silas looked at Red, whose tail was twitching slightly as the sage smoke worked its influence. The dog had never asked for anything except companionship and the chance to serve someone he loved. If Silas could give him a few more months by finally becoming the man he should have been, how could he refuse? If I agree to this, how will I know what to do? I've been alone so long, I'm not sure I remember how to talk to people. Joseph stood and shouldered his medicine bundle. The spirits will guide you, as they have guided you to this moment. Trust in the compass your father gave you, not just the brass instrument, but the moral direction he tried to instill. Will I see you again? Silas asked, but when he looked around, Joseph Crowfeather was gone. The only evidence of his presence was the lingering scent of sage smoke and the steady improvement in Red's breathing. The dog was sitting up now, alert and focused in a way he hadn't been for weeks. Whatever power the sacred sage contained, it was working with efficiency that defied medical explanation. Silas knelt beside his restored companion and scratched behind Red's ears, feeling the warm pulse of life beneath his fingers. Looks like we're taking a trip, old friend. Think you're up for one last adventure? Red's answering bark was strong and clear, echoing off the cliff face like a challenge thrown at the dawn sky. For the first time in 30 years, Silas began to make plans that led towards something rather than away from it. The descent from high country felt like traveling backward through time, each mile carrying Silas further from the sanctuary he'd built and closer to a world that had changed beyond recognition. Red trotted beside his horse with renewed vigor, the sacred sage having restored not just his strength, but something approaching youthful enthusiasm for exploration. Silas had packed light for the journey, taking only what he couldn't replace: his father's compass, Tommy's dog tags and Purple Heart, Sarah's letters, Emma's photograph, and tools necessary for survival. The rest of his mountain life he left behind in the cabin, understanding that the man who might eventually return would be fundamentally different from the one leaving. Weather held fair for the first 2 days, with clear skies and warm temperatures that made riding pleasant despite emotional weight of the journey. But as they dropped below timberline and entered country where other people might be encountered, Silas found his anxiety growing. He hadn't spoken to another human being besides Joseph Crowfeather in over 5 years. Now he would have to navigate not just physical landscape but complex social terrain of civilization. He would have to find Emma somehow, approach her without causing alarm, and convince her to listen to a story that painted him as both her father and the source of her mother's greatest sorrow. But each time doubt crept in, he would look at Red's bright eyes and remember the bargain he'd made. The dog's renewed health was contingent on Silas following through with his commitment. To turn back now would be to sentence his most loyal friend to death, and that was a betrayal he couldn't commit. On the 3rd day, they reached the boundary of Bridger-Teton National Forest, marked by signs that looked startlingly official compared to the unmarked wilderness Silas had called home. According to the trail map, Jackson Hole was still 2 days' ride southeast, following valleys that would take them through increasingly populated country. The first sign of civilization was a campground, mostly empty in late summer but still showing evidence of recent use. Silas had intended to avoid such places, but Red suddenly started limping, favoring his right front paw in a way that demanded immediate attention. Examining Red's paw revealed a small cut between his toes, probably from sharp rock during their descent, but nothing that wouldn't heal with proper care. Silas cleaned the wound and bandaged it with strips torn from an old shirt, then sat back to study his companion with growing concern. "Maybe we should rest here for a day," Silas said, more to himself than to Red. "Let that paw heal up proper before we push on." But even as he spoke, he knew delay was dangerous. Each day he spent avoiding the inevitable confrontation was another day for his courage to erode, another opportunity for the rational part of his mind to construct arguments. For retreat. That evening, as they shared a simple meal beside their campfire, Silas found himself talking to Red in a way he hadn't done in years. "I keep thinking about what she'll look like," he said, feeding Red scraps of jerky while fire crackled between them. "The vision showed me a grown woman, confident and capable, but she's still my little girl in ways I'll probably never understand. How do you approach someone who's lived their whole life without you and explain that you're sorry?" Red's tail thumped against the ground, and his intelligent eyes reflected firelight in a way that made him seem almost human in his understanding. "The truth is, I'm terrified," Silas continued. "Not of dying, not of getting hurt, but of seeing. Disappointment in her eyes when she realizes who I am, of having her look at me the way I've been looking at myself for 30 years, like a man who had everything that mattered and threw it all away." The night sounds of the forest provided familiar backdrop to his confession. Owls calling from distant trees, wind through pine boughs, the subtle rustle of small creatures moving through underbrush. These were sounds that had comforted him through decades of solitude, but now they felt like echoes from a past that was rapidly receding. Red rose and padded over to rest his grizzled head on Silas's knee. The gesture was simple but profound, a vote of confidence from the one creature whose judgment Silas trusted completely. The next morning brought low clouds and the threat of rain, but also a clarity of purpose that had been absent from Silas's life for longer than he cared to calculate. He broke camp efficiently, loaded his gear, and pointed his horse toward the trail that led to Jackson Hole and whatever awaited him there. By late afternoon, they could see Jackson Hole spread out before them, a prosperous tourist town surrounded by spectacular mountain scenery. The sight of so many buildings, so many people, so much organized civilization made Silas feel dizzy with culture shock. But somewhere in that maze of streets and buildings was his daughter, the woman who carried his blood and Sarah's wisdom, who had grown up wondering about the father who had abandoned her, who might, if he was extraordinarily lucky, be willing to listen to an old man's apology. Silas checked his father's compass. One more time, watching the needle swing steadily north toward truth and responsibility, then urged his horse forward down the final stretch of trail. Red fell into step beside them, alert and ready for whatever challenges lay ahead, and together they rode toward the most important conversation of Silas Boone's life. Jackson Hole struck Silas like a physical blow when they finally rode into town. The modern world had exploded here in ways he couldn't have imagined. Paved streets filled with automobiles, buildings reaching toward the sky with glass and steel, people everywhere wearing clothes and carrying devices that spoke of technologies he'd never seen. Red stayed close to the horse's hooves, his ears flattened against the assault of sounds and smells that had no equivalent in the wilderness they'd left behind. Car engines rumbled, horns honked, music poured from open doorways, and the sense of restaurants and exhaust created sensory overload. Silas had expected change, but not transformation this complete. This place was something else entirely, a destination designed to separate wealthy visitors from their money while showing them a sanitized version of the American West. His first priority was finding information about Emma. The Grand Teton National Park headquarters would be the logical place to start his search. The building was more imposing than he'd expected, a modern structure that spoke of federal authority and bureaucratic efficiency. Through large windows, he could see people in uniform moving about their business, and his heart hammered with the possibility that one of them might be Emma. But the uniforms all looked the same, from a distance, green and brown clothing that marked the wearer as a Park Service representative, but revealed nothing about individual identity. A young woman at the information desk looked up as he approached, her smile professional but genuinely welcoming. "Can I help you?" she asked, and Silas realized he'd been standing in front of her desk for several moments without speaking. "I'm looking." "And for someone," he managed, "a ranger named Emma Boone." The woman's expression shifted slightly, becoming more curious and somehow more careful. "Emma's not here right now. She's leading a nature program up at Jenny Lake. Can I ask what this is about?" "It's personal," he said finally. "Family business that's been too long delayed." Something in his tone must have convinced her of his sincerity, because her expression softened and she consulted a schedule. "The nature program should be finishing up around 4 o'clock. Jenny Lake is about 20 minutes north of here." The ride to Jenny Lake took them through country that was more familiar, but still changed by tourism infrastructure. Paved roads replaced dirt trails, he remembered, and signs marked every significant feature as if the landscape couldn't be trusted to speak for itself. Jenny Lake itself was beautiful, in the way that only alpine lakes could be, its surface reflecting surrounding. Peaks like a mirror made of liquid sky. But the shoreline was crowded with visitors, families with children, and elderly couples, and groups of young people who treated the wilderness like an outdoor gymnasium. Silas found a place to tie his horse where she wouldn't interfere with tourist traffic, then made his way toward a group gathered around someone clearly giving a presentation. As he got closer, he could hear a woman's voice, clear and confident, explaining something about the geology of the area. And then he saw her, and the world seemed to stop spinning. Emma stood in the center of the group, wearing the uniform he'd seen in the vision, but somehow more real, more present, more undeniably his daughter than any supernatural revelation could have conveyed. She was exactly the right height, exactly. The right build, with hair that caught afternoon light the same way Sarah's had 30 years ago. But her face was unmistakably his own, reflected back through feminine grace and professional confidence. She was explaining something about the formation of the Teton Range, using gestures to illustrate the movement of ancient rock formations, and her voice carried authority that came from deep knowledge, combined with genuine love for her subject. Silas found himself frozen at the edge of the group, afraid to move closer, but unable to walk away. This was his daughter, the child Sarah had raised alone, the woman who had found her way to the mountains he loved, despite growing up without his guidance. But as he watched her interact with people in her group, answering questions and sharing knowledge with obvious joy, Silas began to understand the magnitude of what he was asking. Emma had built a life here, had created a professional identity and personal relationships that had nothing to do with him. She'd succeeded despite his absence, not because of any contribution he'd made. What right did he have to intrude on that success with his need for redemption? The nature program was winding down, and people were beginning to disperse back toward the parking area. Emma was packing up her materials, folding a portable easel, and gathering visual aids she'd used during her presentation. Soon she would be gone, and the opportunity to approach her would be lost. But Silas found his feet rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the certainty that he was about to destroy something beautiful with his selfish need for forgiveness. Emma looked happy, fulfilled, surrounded by work and environment that brought out the best in her. Why should he risk damaging that with revelations about a past she'd clearly moved beyond? Red whined softly beside him, and Silas looked down to see the dog watching Emma with the same intensity he'd shown at the cave when visions first began. Emma had finished packing and was starting to walk toward the parking area, her ranger hat casting a shadow across features that were so familiar they made his chest ache. In a few more seconds, she would disappear around a bend in the trail, and the moment would be lost forever. But just as she reached the edge of his vision, something made her turn back toward the lake. Her gaze swept across the remaining visitors, paused for a moment on an elderly couple still taking photographs, then settled on Silas with the kind of professional assessment park rangers used to evaluate potential problems. Their eyes met across 30 yards of mountain meadow, and Silas felt something electric pass between them. Not recognition exactly, but a moment of connection that seemed to surprise them both. Emma's step faltered, and she tilted her head slightly, as if trying to solve a puzzle that had just presented itself. She took a step toward him, then another, and Silas realized his moment of decision had arrived, whether he was ready for it or not. "Excuse me," Emma said as she approached, her voice carrying professional courtesy she'd use with any park visitor who seemed out of place. "Are you all right? You look like you might need some assistance." Up close, the resemblance was even more striking. Emma had his dark eyes, the same stubborn set to her jaw, and Sarah's gentle way of tilting her head when trying to understand something complicated. She was beautiful in the way confident, capable women were beautiful, not from perfection of feature, but from inner light that came from knowing her place in the world. "I'm fine," Silas managed, though his voice came out rougher than intended. "Just admiring the country. Been a long time since I've been down this way." Emma's gaze flicked to Red, who was sitting patiently, but watching her with unusual intensity. "That's a beautiful dog. Australian cattle dog, right? You don't see many of them up here." "Red's been my partner for 12 years, Silas said, grateful for a safe topic. "He's getting on in years, but he still thinks he's young enough to herd anything that moves." Something about his accent or manner must have triggered recognition, because Emma's expression grew more thoughtful. She studied his face with careful attention of someone trying to place a familiar stranger. "You have a local connection?" she asked. "Something about your voice sounds familiar, though I can't place it." This was the moment Silas had been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. He could deflect the question, make small talk, and walk away with his secret intact. Or he could find courage to tell her the truth and accept whatever consequences followed. Red whined softly and nudged against his leg, and Silas remembered the bargain he'd made with Joseph Crowfeather. Emma deserved to know that the father she'd wondered about hadn't stopped thinking about her, even if he'd been too much of a coward to do anything about it. "My name is Silas Boone," he said, the words coming out in a rush before his courage. All could fail. "I knew your mother, Sarah McKenna, back in Nebraska, a long time ago, before you were born." Emma's face went very still, and Silas saw the moment when understanding hit her like a physical blow. Her eyes widened, then narrowed as she studied his features with new intensity, searching for confirmation of what her mind was already beginning to accept. "Boone," she repeated slowly. "That's my last name. My mother's maiden name was McKenna, but she gave me the name Boone because—" She stopped mid-sentence, her face pale under her ranger's tan. "Because it was your father's name," Silas finished, quietly. "Because I was supposed to marry her and help raise you, and instead I ran away like a coward and left her to face everything alone." The silence stretched between them, filled with 30 years of questions and explanations that had never been given. Emma's professional composure cracked, revealing the vulnerable young woman underneath who had grown up wondering why her father hadn't wanted her enough to stay. "You're him," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "After all this time, after all the wondering and stories Mom told me, you just show up here like you're asking for directions." The anger in her voice was controlled but unmistakable, and Silas felt it like a knife between his ribs. "I know you have no reason to listen to me. I know I have no right to ask for your time after what I did. But I wanted you to know that not a day has passed in 30 years that I haven't thought about you, wondered what kind of woman you'd become." Emma took a step back, her hand moving instinctively toward the radio on her belt. "Do you have any idea what you put her through?" "What?" It was like for my mother to raise a child alone in a town where everyone knew she'd been abandoned. Do you have any concept of what it feels like to grow up wondering if there was something wrong with you that made your own father run away? Each word hit Silas like a physical blow, but he forced himself to stand still and take the punishment he'd earned. I know I can't undo any of that. I know saying I'm sorry doesn't begin to make up for 30 years of absence. But I wanted you to know that I never stopped loving you, even when I was too much of a coward to show it. Love. Emma's voice cracked with emotion. You think abandonment is love? You think running away from responsibility is some kind of twisted expression of caring? Silas pulled the artifacts from his pockets. His father's compass, Tommy's dog, tags and Purple Heart, Emma's photograph, Sarah's letters, and held them out like an offering. These are the only things that mattered to me up there in the mountains. Your mother's letters, a picture of you that somehow found its way to me, reminders of the family I walked away from. Emma stared at the collection of objects, her anger warring with curiosity and something that might have been longing. Where did you get that photograph? And how do you have my uncle's military decorations? The question opened a door Silas hadn't expected, and he found himself telling Emma about the visions at the cave, about Tommy's heroic death and their father's broken heart, about Sarah's strength in raising their daughter alone. He spoke quickly, afraid she would walk away before he could explain everything. When he finished, Emma was crying, quiet tears she wiped away as soon as they appeared. Mom never told me about the cave, about any visions or spirits, but she did tell me that you loved the mountains, that you needed wide open spaces more than you needed people. I used to wonder if that's why I became a park ranger, if I was trying to understand what was more important to you than your own family. Nothing was more important, Silas said fiercely. Nothing ever was. I was just too young and too scared to understand that running away from difficulty doesn't solve anything. Emma looked at Red, who had moved closer during their conversation, and was now sitting directly between them as if trying to bridge the gap. Mom died 3 years ago. Cancer. She fought it for 2 years, but in the end she was just too tired to keep fighting. The news hit Silas like an avalanche, crushing his chest and making it impossible to breathe. Sarah was gone, had died while he was still hiding in his mountain sanctuary, had faced her final battle without knowing that he'd never stopped thinking about her. Did she? He began, then had to stop and clear his throat. At the end, did she ever say anything about me? Did she forgive me for what I did? Emma's expression softened slightly, and for the first time since she'd learned his identity, she looked at him with something other than anger. She said she hoped you'd found whatever you were looking for up there in the wilderness. And she said that if you ever decided to come back, I should give you a chance to explain yourself before I decided whether to hate you. The permission implicit in those words gave Silas hope he hadn't dared to feel since arriving in Jackson Hole. Sarah, even in death, was still trying to heal the wounds his abandonment had created. Would you be willing to do that? He asked. Give me a chance to tell you the whole story, to try to make you understand why I left and why I came back. Emma looked at him for a long moment, her face cycling through emotions too complex to name. Finally, she glanced at her watch and made a decision that would determine the course of both their lives. I get off work in an hour, she said. There's a cemetery just outside of town where Mom is buried. If you want to explain yourself, that seems like the right place to do it. The cemetery sat on a hill overlooking Jackson Hole, where the valley opened toward the Teton Range and the mountains Silas had called home for 30 years. Sarah's grave was marked by a simple granite headstone bearing her name, her dates, and a single line, "Beloved mother and teacher, she made the world better." Emma knelt beside the grave and placed wildflowers she'd gathered during their walk from the parking area. I come here every week, she said quietly. Talk to her about work, about people I meet, about the seasons changing. It helps somehow. Silas stood awkwardly a few feet away, hat in his hands, feeling like an intruder on a sacred ritual he had no right to witness. Red had positioned himself between Silas and Emma, as if the dog understood his role as mediator. She would have liked. "Knowing you became a ranger," Silas said finally. "In her letters, she wrote about how you loved being outdoors, how you asked questions about everything you saw. You read her letters." Emma's voice carried surprise and hurt. "All this time you had her letters and never responded." Silas reached into his pocket and withdrew the bundle of yellowed pages. "I was too much of a coward to open most of them when they came. I read them all for the first time just a week ago, and that's when I learned about you. That's what finally gave me the courage to leave the mountain." Emma took the letters with trembling hands, recognizing her mother's careful handwriting. "She wrote to you for months after you left. I remember her sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings, working on letters by lamplight. She was trying to save us," Silas said, "trying to bring me home before it was too late. If I'd had the courage to read these when they arrived, maybe things would have been different." Emma read portions of the letters in the gathering dusk, her mother's words carrying across 30 years like voices from another world. When she reached the final letter, the one that revealed her existence and Sarah's determination to raise her child alone, fresh tears began to fall. "She never spoke badly of you," Emma said, looking up from the pages. "Even when people would make comments, even when I asked direct questions about why you left, she always said you were a good man who'd made a difficult choice." "She was protecting you," Silas replied, "keeping you from growing up with hatred for a man who wasn't worth the energy." They sat in silence for several minutes, watching the last light fade from the peaks. Red had settled on the grass between them, his presence a bridge across the chasm of years and regret. "Tell me about the cave," Emma said finally. "Tell me about these visions that convinced you to come down after all this time." Silas described the petroglyphs and the experiences that had forced him to confront his past. He told her about seeing Tommy's final battle, about witnessing Sarah's struggles as a single mother, about the sacred artifacts that had materialized from stone. Emma listened with the attention of someone who spent her days in wild places where the boundary between natural and supernatural was often blurred. "There are places in these mountains that feel different," she said when he finished, "sacred places that the indigenous peoples still consider holy. I've felt things in some locations that I couldn't explain to my supervisors." Joseph Crow Feather called it a healing ground, Silas said. "A place where lost souls could find their way back to the path they were meant to follow." Emma's eyes widened. "You met Joseph? He's something of a legend around here. Appears when people need guidance, disappears when his work is done." The validation made Silas feel less like he was losing his sanity. "He made me a bargain. Red's life for my commitment to face the truth and make whatever amends I could." As if summoned by his name, Red rose and padded over to Emma, resting his grizzled head on her knee with gentle trust. Emma scratched behind his ears, and the dog's tail thumped with contentment. "What happens now?" Emma asked, her hand still stroking Red's fur. "You've found me. You've told me the truth. What do you want from me?" "I want to be your father," Silas said finally. "Not the father I should have been when you were growing up. That chance is gone forever. But whatever kind of father you might be willing to let me become now." Emma was quiet for so long that Silas began to fear she would reject him entirely. But when she finally spoke, her voice held a mixture of caution and hope. "I'm engaged," she said, "to another park ranger named David. We're planning to marry next spring, and I'd like to have a father walk me down the aisle. If you think you can learn to stay instead of run, if you can prove you're ready to be part of a family, then maybe we can figure out what being father and daughter means when you're starting from scratch." The offer was more than Silas had dared to hope for, and he felt tears he'd held back for 30 years finally breaking free. "I'll stay," he promised. "I'll learn whatever I need to learn, do whatever I need to do." 6 months later, on a crisp morning in April, Silas Boone walked his daughter down the aisle of a small chapel overlooking the Teton Range. He wore a new suit that felt strange after decades in wilderness clothing, and his hands shook as he placed Emma's hand in David's and stepped back to take his seat. Red, now wearing a formal collar, sat beside him with dignity of a creature who understood the importance of the moment. The old dog had thrived during their transition to valley living, enjoying regular veterinary care and the company of other people while still accompanying Silas on daily walks. Silas had found work with the Park Service, sharing his knowledge of the high country with visitors and helping maintain trails he'd traveled as a hermit. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was the life he'd been meant for, connected to the mountains he loved, but anchored by relationships that gave his experience meaning beyond mere survival. As Emma and David exchanged vows, Silas thought about the cave and the visions that had changed everything. He'd returned there once with Emma and David to show them the petroglyphs and tell them about the experiences that had brought him back into the world. The stone figures had looked ordinary in daylight, just weathered carvings that spoke of ancient peoples and ancient wisdom. But Joseph Crowfeather had been there, standing quietly at the clearing's edge, as if he'd been waiting for their arrival. He'd nodded once at Silas, a gesture that seemed to convey approval and completion, then disappeared into the forest with the silent grace of someone who belonged to wild places between worlds. Emma laughed at something David whispered, and the sound carried across the chapel like music. It was Sarah's laugh, bright and joyful and full of hope for the future, and for the first time in 30 years, Silas Boone felt like he was exactly where he belonged.